later. Okay, I come to talk, or I could go outside and enjoy the weather. C'est bon? Vous êtes en ligne? C'est vrai? Et là, je ne vois pas. Oh!
It's what? Still early?
I didn't see you.
Oh, do you need me to sit?
For the presentation, Julie?
Okay.
Okay. C'est bon? C'est bon?
You want the lectern so you can put your notes on?
Oh!
Would that be okay?
No.
No? I should sit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming and to listen to this research talk. And I just want to mention a few things. We're actually diffusing online as well. So if we want to just try not to make too much noise because our microphone is going to capture everything. So I don't mean to say that you have to stay still and don't move, but so anyways, well, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're really pleased to welcome today Darla, who is a professor at the University of Concordia and also a member of our group, CREGÉS, the Center for Research and Expertise in Social Gerontology, and also a member of ENGAGE, represented here by Fatima, the research coordinator there. And we have our votes, our signs, ENGAGE, and CREGÉS. We do organize these talks and collaborations. Sometimes it's always nice. I just want to, before I let Darla tell you all about her exciting research, I'm just going to say a few words about her. Before becoming a professor at Concordia, she completed a PhD in recreation and leisure studies at the University of Waterloo. And that was in 2011 that she graduated. And then she continued with a postdoctoral fellowship, specifically in the areas of, again, recreation and leisure, but in dementia care. So we've got an expert here. And I want to thank her for taking the time at the end of the semester to come and share her expertise and her research with us. And we're also very glad that she's a member of CREGÉS. She's been for a year with us, very active on several committees. And without further ado, Dr. Darla, thank you.
Well, thanks, everybody. I'm supposed to sit down, I know, for the camera to be on me, I guess. One thing that Julie did mention, probably not in my bio to mention, but the one reason I'm pretty excited about this particular work is I also used to work in long-term care myself. I'm originally from Nova Scotia, and I spent a number of years as director of therapeutic recreation at a long-term care home in Halifax before returning to grad school at the University of Waterloo. So, and as Julie mentioned, this work is based on my time at the University of Waterloo. So I did do a postdoc fellowship, as she mentioned, with the Partnerships in Dementia Care Alliance there. And what that is all about in a nutshell is looking at changing the culture of dementia care, both in long-term care homes and in community care settings, so that people living with dementia can live well with dementia and figure out what supports are necessary to make that happen, but a collaborative approach to doing that. So not just certainly people living with dementia are at the heart of that work, but so are people who help the care partners, family members, friends, as well as staff that work both in the home and in long-term care homes as well. So that's what it was a larger project that I worked on for a number of years, and this is a piece of that project that I'm particularly excited about, of course, because my background is in recreation and leisure, and I'm excited to talk about that a little bit. So if you can advance the slide, that'd be great. Culture change, first of all. How many people are familiar with that term? Is that something that means anything to anybody? Yeah, okay, so some familiarity with that. It's prone to some misconceptions, I suppose, but generally speaking, it describes transforming long-term care homes from or moving them, I suppose, towards more of a community, a caring spot where relationships are really privileged over tasks. In a nutshell, that's kind of what it means to a lot of people. The one thing about culture change that probably often gets misconstrued is that it's not an end product. You know, so sometimes you'll hear about people engaging in a culture change process in long-term care, and they think they have a few meetings, set up a committee, do a couple of projects, and done. You know, with that. But that's not the case. It's a bit more complicated than that, in the sense that it's always an ongoing process, and the process is the important part, I think, because it's always looking at the needs of residents living in long-term care, of staff working in long-term care, and of people visiting long-term care. So at the end of the day, what we're striving for with culture change is that all people involved in a long-term care home ideally are happy and feel, you know, excited to come to work, excited to come to visit, excited to live there. And obviously that comes with its own set of challenges that maybe it sounds idealistic to make everybody happy at all times, but that's the hope that some conversations can happen, and people can work through some challenges and work together very well to create that sense of community within the home, ideally. Good. So next, yeah, thank you. So just a bit of historical perspective on culture change. It began quite a while ago. It began with individuals working in long-term care being kind of upset. I mean, this was decades ago now, so you can imagine we've come a long way, I think, in long-term care homes over the years, luckily. But back at this point in time, people were pretty discouraged with the state of affairs in long-term care, and that it was mostly care was being guided by medical model approach to care, in the sense that what was being privileged was, I know over the years I've heard different terms like bath and body work and things like that, where you don't take into consideration people's actual entire lives and their whole selves. It's just a matter of servicing or trying to fix an illness or disease in some way, and that's what gets privileged, and that guides everything that happens, unfortunately, to policies and approaches to care. And sometimes it's easy when that happens to forget that people are at the heart of what it is we're doing. So people were pretty discouraged with that and began to call for changes in long-term care, and wanted some radical change to make it seem again a lot less institutionalized and a lot more community oriented, and where people get to know each other, where relationships are formed, those sorts of things. It gained momentum in 1997 with a group of advocates that they came together and called themselves the Pioneer Network, and they have done a lot of work since then, very advocacy type work, and leading voices around the culture change movement, both in the U.S., more loudly, I think, in the U.S. than in Canada, but certainly there's been movement here as well with hosting conferences. In Canada we have the Walk With Me Culture Change Conference, and in the US there's a Pioneer Network conference that happens annually as well. And just again, thinking about how we can move away from this focus on the medical, and examine our languages, our approaches, our policies, things of that nature, to move towards more of a community-based and caring kind of environment in long-term care. So some principles that guide the culture change movement, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's some of the main principles that were put forth over the years, and certainly by the Pioneer Network and others who are active in this work. First, and they sound very common sense, and probably sound a little bit easy, actually, sometimes, but that's not always the case. But there are efforts in various forms, I think, coast to coast and outside of Canada as well, in moving in this direction and using these principles to guide care. So the first one, knowing each person. One way that does happen in some long-term care homes is, this is just one example, but it could be ensuring that there's consistent staff caring for consistent residents, so that they have the opportunity to develop deeper relationships and more getting to know residents more and getting, obviously the residents get to know staff. Things like that can happen a little bit more easily when there are those consistent matchings in that sense. Opportunities for choice and self-determination, that happens when residents are able to determine how they spend their day, basically. Things like dining schedules, care routines, if they sleep late and want to continue to do that because that's what they did in their own home, if they eat at a certain time or have a certain way of being that's maintained and respected. That's one way, one example of that happening. Treating people with dignity and respect typically happens when the approach to care changes from the task at hand and more the focus on the person, where it's not about getting your set task or set amount of work done. It's really taking the time to sit, talk, maybe have a cup of tea, get sidetracked a little bit, that sort of thing. Cultivating close interdependent relationships, as well as creating home-like environments. A lot of homes now, you'll see movements towards transforming large communal spaces into smaller living units. Neighborhoods is one thing that often, I've seen trends there with long-term care homes developing neighborhoods where, everyone involved creates this home-like kind of atmosphere there, in a pocket of the long-term care home. And then finally, collaborating on decisions being made. That's really about ensuring that residents have the same rights, obviously the same possibilities and opportunities that they had when they lived in their own homes before moving into long-term care. That comes often, there's an acknowledgement of some risk there as well, but making space for that and having conversations so that people can maintain some of their past interests and keep that going when they move into long-term care, and figuring out ways to make that a reality. So, yeah, making sure I'm on the right slide there. Leisure in long-term care, it's not something that's ever really been talked about a lot with respect to culture change before, and quite frankly, that surprises me a bit, as I'm sure many of you are aware that leisure is quite commonly recognized as a big contributor to quality of life for all of us. When you think about your own lives, certainly in the life of long-term care homes and residents living in long-term care homes, but it's not really thought about beyond that very much. And unfortunately, and this isn't a knock on therapeutic recreation at all, because that's obviously important as well, but sometimes when we think about leisure and long-term care, the therapy side maybe gets privileged a little bit too much, and it's about therapy with an end goal for fixing some aspect of a person, as opposed to just and what that looks like. And again, keeping that in mind with respect to not only people living in long-term care, but people working in long-term care, visiting long-term care. Leisure can be a real, life infuser, I think, into long-term care, and bring some happiness and joy to the life of a lot of folks, really. So with all of that in mind, that's what we set out to think about this, and wanted to do research on. Let's talk to recreation professionals working in long-term care across the country, and see, particularly those who are working in homes that identify with going through a culture change movement, and see what they feel their role is in the process, and how they're changing their approach to services, to recreation and leisure services in the home and things like that. So that's what brought this study on. So next slide, great. So we set out to ask the following questions of professionals. First, what are the recreation and leisure practitioners who we spoke with? What are their perceptions of culture change and the initiatives happening within their home? So again, we very explicitly wanted to talk to people who identified with with going through a culture change process. So if they worked at homes who weren't familiar with the term or weren't doing any types of initiatives to bring about culture change, then they were excluded from this particular study, because we wanted to speak to people who were involved in that process. And a surprisingly large number of homes did identify with that, luckily, so we got a fairly good response, I think, from people, but not I spoke in the end to 23 professionals almost from coast to coast. The breakdown was 10 practitioners from Ontario. I was obviously living there at the time and most connected to long-term care homes there, so it was a little easier to recruit folks working in Ontario long-term care homes. We had 3 participants from each of British Columbia, New Brunswick, and Manitoba. We had 2 from Alberta and 1 each from Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. So you'll notice that Quebec is unfortunately missing, and that wasn't due to lack of trying, of course, and I'm sure there are homes here that are involved in culture change. And of course, being an English-speaking person, I did translate some of the materials, and when I found out I was coming to do this talk today, I got excited and thought, well, maybe I could just start going with my research over again and do some interviews here. But anyway, unfortunately, at the time, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, I wasn't able to get anyone to agree to participate in the study from Quebec. So most provinces represented, and as I said, 23 participants, 20, again, probably not surprising given the gender breakdown in long-term care generally, and certainly in recreation positions, but 20 of the participants were female, 3 were male. Most of them held a management position, so they were involved in recreation and leisure services within their home, but often they worked there for a number of years and worked up, so they were director or manager or something of recreation. Range of time in the position that they've held or in working in long-term care at all, I suppose, in the home ranged between 3 years was the least and 20 years was the most, and the average was a bit higher. Most people had been there for over 10 years at least. And the number of residents ranged between a couple of homes were as small as about 67 residents, and the largest home was 263 residents, and the average was about 200 for most homes that we spoke to. So, so again, just to get back to the questions here, we've asked about their perceptions, about what they perceive their role in the culture change process to be, and what recreation and leisure practitioners are doing to support the culture change process within their home, as well as how they describe their experience with culture change. So really the interviews focused on, again, and many of them agreed that they didn't really think that much about it before the interview about their specific role or how leisure in particular is a contributing factor, but they did often identify and quickly identified a number of things that have changed in their approach to providing recreation and leisure services as a result of going through culture change. So the remaining part of my talk here today is I'm just going to walk you through a number of the main themes from that study and examples that people provided that showed how culture change was taking place within the home. So the first one is there. Okay, I know it's getting cut off there at the top, but relational leisure opportunities. So a number of people talked about moving away, and as a direct result of going through the culture change process, that they weren't, for the most part, many of the participants weren't doing this already, or at least explicitly doing this already, or knowing that they were doing it, so they were deliberately shifting as a result of going through culture change, from moving away from a focus on disability and really knowing a person's disability and approaching the person from that perspective with a goal to alleviate some sort of symptom associated with the disability or whatever, to more of a focusing on the resident, who the resident really is, more broadly speaking. So here's just a quote that represents that. I don't know a lot of people in terms of their disability. I don't know a person. I know that person is a person. What makes them happy? What energizes them? What creates opportunities of life for them? So, again, talking about, there were a number of people, surprising to me, who talked about not even being concerned with learning about various disabilities that residents have, which I know is probably a bit of a shift for a lot of people, but sometimes it just doesn't matter at the end of the day. If I know what energizes them, if I know what they love to do, and I can help make that happen at the end of the day, that's what I see my main goal as being. Again, next slide. So also getting to know residents' life stories and things that invigorate them. When that privileged when that's, people make time for that. It really can spark this sense of finding out, unique aspects of residents and really use that to develop some new and interesting leisure initiatives in the home as well. So again, this quote, we have a gentleman here that actually invented the pizza pop, and that's, just disguise that. I can't remember off the top of my head, it was some type of food item that this person invented, but just to maintain confidentiality here, I switched it up, but which we didn't know until his family told us. We did a program around that, and his nephew bought in the dough, and he told us exactly what ingredients he wanted for it, so they did a whole program because they found out a particular aspect of that, that individual. And that was something that we were seeing, or I was seeing in interviews happening more and more frequently, where there was kind of some spontaneous programming ideas that were coming out of learning more about what residents, their abilities, their talents, their skills, and in their life before they came into long-term care, and what they're still interested in doing. Also with relational leisure, it's supported when staff are attuned to residents' relational needs and looking again at the whole person and how they can provide for persons, and maintaining helping to maintain a sense of relationships with their family members and with friends that they've maintained through the years. So with this particular quote, just to give some context to this, it was it was really a heartwarming story. It was about a lady, one of the residents, who her and her husband for a number of years went to this particular restaurant every year. It was their special place, and she shared that information with one of the recreation staff, who, when they're an upcoming bus trip, they were going out to that particular restaurant for lunch. And typically, I think on that outing, it's not common for family members to join. It's really just a resident outing mostly. I don't know if it did happen occasionally or not, but she said, we really wanted to surprise this particular lady, that she'd love it if her husband actually joined us. So they made arrangements without her knowing to have her hair done, talked to the nursing staff, got her dressed up that day, made all those arrangements, made arrangements obviously with her husband to come and join her at the restaurant, and she had no idea. So she said, we made these arrangements with her hairdresser to have her made up that day. The nursing staff all knew she was dressed to go out that day, and she was waiting for the bus when she saw her partner and said, what are you doing here this early? And he says, well, we're going out for lunch at this particular place together. And she started crying. She was so happy. So those sorts of stories were really common. I mean, this is just one of a bunch, but that resulted from, going that extra step, getting to know residents, and within the context of the relationships that they have with, their husbands and wives and sons and daughters and other friends as well in their life. And then finally, on this particular theme, opportunities to get to know each person's unique skills and abilities were not limited to residents. So coming back to my point earlier that leisure and culture change isn't often, we hear the focus on residents, of course, and perhaps that's where it should be, but it's also important that a long-term care home through a culture change process becomes a place where people love to come to work, where people love to come to visit. And so getting to know other people in the mix was deemed to be just as important, as getting to know residents and their whole life stories and things like that. So as one of the participants had shared with me, she said, if a team member has a special talent, like a flower arranging, and they're a nurse or a PSW, maybe the recreation staff can go do the tea cart for a while, and the PSW runs the program, so they can do a flower arranging program. And again, this was a pretty frequent thing. One example of many here, where I heard stories, about finding out that there's somebody on staff. I think it was someone who worked in housekeeping. Was an artist, and all of a sudden that branched off into having some art programs, both for residents and for staff members, and really kind of brought some life to the home because they found those things out about different staff, skills and abilities as well. The next theme I wanted to discuss is sharing power in decision making, and how that's a central part of the culture change process as well. So leisure experiences in that sense are more likely to be meaningful when they are freely chosen, of course. That's what leisure really is, a freely chosen activity that's self-directed. But surprisingly, a number of participants in the study talked about that not always being the case, that, you know, things are, they make up, obviously, as many of us do who work in long-term care, make up a monthly calendar, and maybe with varying degrees of input from residents or from family, based on some of the things, you know, that have been popular from month to month, and keep going with the same activities that we think everybody enjoys and that sort of thing. But some new and innovative programs resulted from this, where one of the staff talked about, you know, we do a diners club and we take residents to the grocery store, they pick out their own groceries and come back and make their own meals. We had one resident say he had never been to the grocery store in about 5 years, and he was amazed at the self-checkout and had a laugh every time he'd pick something up and scan it. So this is, you know, again, just one example of many where residents were starting to, you know, choose what they wanted to do and make more and more decisions for themselves around meal making and other sort of leisure activities as well. Also, sharing decisions can happen by moving away from having this monthly leisure guide at all and letting residents decide. So this was a bit of a radical, I didn't hear this a whole lot, but when I heard it, it excited me a bit. You know, a number of staff talked about how they would, in fact, there was one example where they put up a big whiteboard and with all the activities on the board, and invited residents to come and, you know, said, erase off anything that you don't want to have on there, basically in your month schedule. And they were amazed with the result, because there were all these programs that were typically well attended by residents, and they were going in and erasing them off the calendar. And then when they're questioning that, like, well, you always go to this particular program exercise 3 times a week, whatever it is that was happening. And they says, yeah, we go to it because that's the only thing that's offered, you know, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 o'clock. We have nothing else to do, we'll go to that. So when they were invited to decide that for themselves and suggest some alternatives, it really made a huge difference. And the staff, you know, that were involved in that particular exercise were pretty amazed. They do things called like neighborhood time, where they'll have maybe load up a cart, having a set calendar. They do things called like neighborhood time, where they'll have maybe load up a cart with a number of different supplies on it, and wheel that into a certain neighborhood and just kind of say, what do you feel like doing today? Here's, you know, 5 or 6 or however many options to choose from. Let's figure that out together. And that's been a real change, you know, real positive change that they noted in their programming as well. So this quote I just wanted to share was indicative of that, when residents do suggest things that just, it may on some level seem obvious sometimes, but the staff weren't necessarily thinking about it. So they said, we have a lot of Chinese residents in our home, and they implemented English classes. It was such a simple idea, but for us to put that into place, it just wasn't something we were thinking of. We discovered that the residents' self-esteem is so much better because they're the ones making the decisions in their leisure and well-being activities. So again, a lot more input, you know, really results in some great things happening there. Also, increasing opportunities for shared decision-making can help support residents to engage in more familiar activities and traditions that they've had. So one staff spoke about, you know, that we have grandmas and grandpas in the home that have their, you know, let's support them in having their grandkids over for a sleepover, because that's what they did when they were in their home. They might have babysat, they might have had sleepovers. So how can we help support that and make that happen while they're here? We've also begun to ask, how can we help them make a Sunday night dinner that maybe they have always done, and that was a tradition in their family, and just because, you know, because now they've moved into long-term care, that doesn't necessarily have to come to an end. We can do it differently and support it, but it can still happen. Also, reflecting on why residents are not always provided the same opportunities as others living in the community led to some really great programming that, in fact, in this particular quote I'm about to share, made me just want to sign up in this long-term care home immediately. But it came about, it was asking simply, you know, a staff member said, you know, a number of my friends make their own wine at home. Why can't we do that here? Why can't residents be involved in doing that? And she said it so quickly became the most popular program in the home, you know, for good reason, I think. But you know, they took it to administration and asked about, you know, could we try that? And we're like, okay, why not? And you know, when she was telling me that, she was just so passionate about this program, but also said it's enjoyed by residents. It's also enjoyed. Staff have been getting involved, family members have been getting involved, volunteers have been getting involved, so it's really growing and growing, and of course everybody's enjoying making wine, drinking wine, and having appetizers every month. Excuse me, the next theme that I really noted in this research was focused on celebrating lives. So the idea that dignity and respect is enhanced when staff move beyond the context of just providing care and move toward understanding and valuing residents' whole lives, which I think is a thread that's carried on through a few examples so far, but there's some real initiatives out there that were very much intentional to get to know residents more broadly. And one popular one, or one common one, was revolved around life stories. So this quote, we completed the life stories, and we essentially ended the process with a slideshow version of these stories, pulling highlights and lessons learned, and putting photos and music into a DVD format. And then at the end of each month, when they did the life stories on and discovered a lot of things about certain residents, they would put it on as a red carpet kind of event, and a bio of someone's life sort of thing. So it was like a little movie premiere of the resident's life, and we had these narrative ceremonies. So she really talked about how that became quite a popular thing within the home and made people really feel special. First of all, my story is being featured this month. I'm kind of the star of that show, but also that it really bridge some gaps in getting to know the residents, where family members of not that particular resident, but other family members visiting, or other visitors, volunteers, and staff learn so much more than they would have in the day-to-day context through these life stories. Also, in terms of celebrating lives, we heard about changes that contribute to more meaningful leisure experiences for residents, but also lead to how staff support that happening. So in more cases than not, I've heard about where when leisure is directed or driven by residents, half the time it results in them, maybe a resident is leading a particular exercise program or a particular type of game night or something along those lines. So when that's happening, staff started to take notice and say, this is really important to this particular individual, or they're in charge of it, so they need to be there. And they talked about the shift, which was really powerful to hear about this, but the shift between, in the past, perhaps how it could be easy for, when programming's happening in the morning, in the afternoon, and residents are just going to whatever's on the calendar, that, okay, if there's a physiotherapy appointment or they need to have a bath at that time, someone might just take the resident away from that program without thinking about it, or schedule something that conflicts with programming. But when it's resident driven and they're really an integral piece of that, as I said, if it's the resident that's leading a particular games night or or an activity of some sort, then staff take notice and really work with the resident more so to make that happen. To schedule around that, of course, and enable them to do that. So staff are being more respectful to the residents' time, because the residents are saying, I have to do this activity, or I need to lead that activity, and they're working with residents for that change. When that happens, even if it conflicts with other regularly scheduled stuff, or maybe even dining schedules or things can be adaptable. And learning about residents' lives also helps to ensure their lifestyle preferences can be supported. So again, this quote speaks to that, where we ask about what a typical day is like in their life. How would they like to structure their day? Would they like to get up early? Do they like to sleep in a little bit later? Things that they used to do before they came here. If there was something in particular that they attended in the community on a Friday afternoon, we try to accommodate that and make arrangements for that to happen. This really spoke to me in particular because having, as I said earlier, I worked in long-term care for a number of years, and I remember one of my first experiences was a request, it was probably only 2 weeks into my position, and I got a request from a family member whose mom had recently moved into this long-term care home. She wanted to continue to go to art classes in the community, and she just simply asked me to make that happen, transportation-wise and scheduling and things. And I remember it being really, really difficult to find consistent transportation, accessible transportation, to get her to this program. whenever it was being offered 2 to 3 times a week kind of thing. So in the end, I ended up instead getting a volunteer to come in and do art classes in the long-term care home, which ended up kind of being a popular activity, and it benefited obviously some other residents, but I still think about that as kind of my first failure on the job in a way, because what was most important to this particular lady was to continue to do the art classes in the community with the people that, she had done that in the past when she was living at home, and she had a group of friends that were continuing to do it, and really there's no reason why moving into long-term care should stop that from happening. So I think maybe we could have, worked a little harder, put our heads together and figured out a way to have her, continue on with those community classes. Also, in terms of celebrating lives, seeing residents in the context of their broader lives foster support for choices and preferences in other aspects of daily life as well. So it's not necessarily or only limited to leisure in this sense. It's about, if residents are disappointed with the food, as they said, staff are saying, well, bring me your recipe. What's in your recipe? What is it that you enjoy? So those are the little things that, this particular person talked about that she loves. To me, it's seeing the person as a person, that they have value, and that the recipe has value. So as I said, when thinking about what the resident loves to do, again, not just an activity focus, but food that they love to eat and how that can happen, and maybe it's being a bit creative and having them contribute to that through recipes or what have you, but can really go a long way to celebrating who that person is and the richness of their life. And the final, actually no, sorry, not the final theme, nurturing a relational community was another big one, and that can be created through intentional efforts to strengthen relationships between residents and staff. So this quote, we say to staff, you're more than welcome to participate and enjoy yourself too. This quote, just again to give a little bit of context, was in relation to an exotic animal program that they brought into the home, where they had exotic animals like kangaroos and other types of things that would come on. She said, how many people have seen a baby kangaroo at their work? And so when people come and join and sit next to the residents and participate with them, relationships are built, they're communicating with each other rather than sitting, at the back of the room and just watching residents do something on their own. So it's a bit more interactive in that sense. And relationships grow when staff have the opportunities to connect socially with residents in ways that move beyond the provision of care. So a number of people spoke about that, and this quote might not necessarily, I think it's a good quote. I'll just, I'll speak to it first. We went on a fishing trip. It was our chef's day off, and he came along and cooked the fish on site for the residents. A nurse also volunteered his time to go fishing that day because he loved fishing and he never gets the chance to do it. So he participated with the residents and they all had a good time. And as nice as that quote is, and I think it speaks to, again, the opportunity to see residents outside of just providing that care, or cooking their meals or whatever. There's a chef, he goes fishing with them, cooks the fish on site. But it sort of suggests that this only should happen on, the staff day off, or they should volunteer when they're not working to go. I think there's also some effort and movement towards making that happen within the shift, and some people talked about the permission to, for someone on their shift, their nursing staff or what have you, to go along on a bus trip or to go on, certain outings or participate in certain recreation activities alongside the residents as well. Relationships can grow naturally when conditions support relationship-centered care, and what that looks like is basically having, a bit of a blurring of roles sometimes that might result in that. So in this particular quote, she said, I have a team member that has such a strong relationship with one resident that resident only wants her. My rec team member is the only one that can give her a bath because the relationship and the trust that she has. So with the PSWs will run the recreation program while this happens, and my team member will help provide that care to the residents. She'll help with the bath. So with culture change, there's a blending of roles for the common good of the resident. And that was something I heard time and time again, in that it does help when everybody is on the same page around moving forth with culture change. There is a bit of a blending of the roles that happen, and more of a willingness to say, okay, you know, people don't, in the past, I think maybe talk about, well, that's not my job, I'm, you know, here to do this particular duty, or I do recreation, you do, you know, meals, you do the care. But there's a bit more blending, I think, that happens with the culture change process in a lot of homes, where it speaks to the nature of the relationship that certain staff have, and as well as skills and abilities of staff to do some other things, as we heard about earlier with, you know, a skill like flower arranging, or, you know, painting, or something along those lines. And also on that note, in terms of nurturing a relational community, spending time with residents in a social context is conducive for deeper interdependent relationships. And this is what's really important about this is this permission word, I think. So culture change has really given staff permission to take a 5-minute break and sit down with the residents. They have to do their documentation, of course, and that's all very important, but they bring the binders away from the nursing station and do the documentation in the neighborhood or in the lounge with the other residents who join them. I think it's becoming more of an us and them, less of an us and them and more of a we when that happens. So, and again, I think the integral word here, the important word, is permission, and that they spoke about, you know, administration recognizing that, or not getting upset maybe in the past before going through a culture change initiative, if they would walk by and see somebody sitting a little too long having a cup of tea with a resident, or, you know, mingling and chatting, there might have been some form of reprimand for that. But with culture change, when everybody's realizing how important relationships are and privileging that, it does provide that permission for staff to sit a little longer, to take that time, and maybe, you know, it slows them down on some of the tasks they're doing, but that's okay. That's part of it. Good. Okay. So working collaboratively, another theme that came out of this research was really about working together. Means that everyone has a role to play in enhancing life within the home. So I think this stresses the importance that, culture change is not just any one staff's responsibility. It's not just, you know, management's responsibility. Everyone does have a role to play, but there's the necessity often for it to be really strongly supported from the top. So in terms of, you know, everything we do involves answering the question of what's best for the resident. The question I would often hear our CEO ask is, don't talk to me about money, just tell me, is it the right thing to do? Is it best for the resident? And if the answer is yes, we'll figure it out. So, I mean, I know obviously a lot of people are posting in the room, much like I would be, thinking about how money can be, okay, money can be a bit of a deterrent sometimes for things that you want to have happen, but when everybody's putting their heads together, I think there's some creative ways to work around that restriction in some cases, and you know, enabling things to happen, much like that example I shared about, you know, having a wine program or something like along those lines. You know, very simple thing, and it was the question of, well, why not? Why can't we try this? So being a bit willing to do that. Also, working together can ensure that residents enjoy things, you know, even if there's an element of risk involved. So I mentioned before, a lot of things I think, or there could be the tendency to write policies and then, you know, practices shaped around minimizing risk as much as possible. But sometimes when we are really being true to ensuring residents can be who they are and maintain a sense of life that they had before coming into long-term care, there can be an element of risk that's necessary, I think, with that. So, you know, she talks about, we have a gentleman who likes to walk. He walks way farther than I ever would. He likes to do it, and he was getting lost. The family didn't want him to not be able to do those things, so we worked with them and put some tools in place. Now he carries a GPS tracker with him, and he carries a card that indicates he lives here, so he can assume that risk. So again, it's not just, you know, saying no, something can't happen because there's an aspect of risk. It's being able to look at that and saying, well, this is something he really enjoys doing, and he shouldn't have to stop that because there is a bit of risk. How can we work together to solve that? And also working together can result in overcoming some, you know, some other maybe lesser logistical challenges that people think are there that perhaps shouldn't be shouldn't be impacting not providing certain programs or services to residents when they want to do something. And this particular quote he talks about, we have an IMAX theater in our neighborhood, and we had a number of residents who wanted to go and do that. It was challenging because of the logistics, and it was something I wouldn't have come up with by myself. That's a recurring theme as well, as I've said earlier, but it's the idea that some ideas that were brought forth by residents were just not on the radar of the recreation staff in the first place. So that the residents bring it forward. We do want to go to that IMAX theater down the road. Oh, I hadn't thought of it. So, but when it comes to the residents and they say they'd like to do it, you try to solve those problems. So again, that can work together. And there was all sorts of examples as well shared with me about making things happen, where there was one long-term care home with a number of younger residents living there who wanted to go out in the evenings to a club and listen to some live music, but it was past shift time of a lot of the staff, and they got a bit creative with that and adjusted different shifts to make that happen, and worked around some of the logistical challenges around transportation and things with that as well. Working collaboratively also involves or can result in family members seeing themselves as integral members of the community as well. So a lot of this, the emphasis on culture change, as I mentioned, I think it puts, there is an emphasis on quality of life for residents and also for staff maybe as well, less talked about certainly, but it's there. But one thing that gets forgotten, I think, sometimes is the role of family members in the long-term care home. And when family members do see themselves as part of the culture change process, when they're asked to be involved, when they're centrally involved with it, they begin to see how they can contribute to life within the home as well. So, now they're saying, we have family members coming and saying, would it be possible to have this group come in and perform? And we see them coming to us and wanting to introduce other things into our programming. So taking a real, getting into the driver's seat, I think, around those types of things when they're involved in the process that it begins to happen. So all of this to say a couple of things on Leisure's transformational capacity, in that I think there's two really important points around this, and that of course it may be obvious, hopefully a little bit, that Leisure can create some of these opportunities, certainly for recognizing people's personal attributes, their skills, their abilities. It sort of makes those things visible in the home. Through Leisure experiences, people can become known for more than just their work roles, more than just the disability or illness that they might have. You see them much more of a person and what things that they love and that energize them and all those sorts of things. But Leisure programs and practices in and of themselves aren't going to just automatically, transform the life of a home. It needs to be done with a certain amount of intention, and that's one thing that was emphasized by all participants. It was a deliberate change in their programming and their practices that were guided by the culture change principles I highlighted earlier explicitly, and deliberately, in that, trying to be a bit more flexible and allowing for, enabling more choice and trying new things and all that kind of thing. So aligning very much with the culture change principles led to all these changes that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise, I don't think. As I said, I think Leisure can do some pretty amazing things. I'm a bit biased on that point, I know, but it needs to be intentionally and certainly lined up with a number of those culture change principles for it to really make that kind of a difference, I think. And then just to close up here, a couple of things around that was the importance of leadership. So I don't know if you're sitting here wondering, I think I would be at this point like, this all sounds great, but how do I do it? What needs to happen? And one thing that I was told time and time again that made the difference in pretty much every single situation was that they had the style of leadership that really not just talked about culture change. It wasn't just something, oh, let's do culture change because it seems like the right thing to do. They really believed it. And so what that looked like from the leadership within the home was that every single participant talked about, when we have a new idea, whether it's a wine club or whatever, we can, we feel like we can go to our leadership and ask them that. And if it's not something we've ever tried before and we're not really certain of the outcome or how it's going to go, they're okay to try it and kind of take a bit of a chance with that. So they're much more apt to be supportive of of new ideas that are brought forth when they're going through a culture change process like that, and believe in it. And visionary leaders understand that it's, you know, it's not enough just to talk the talk, but they need to walk the walk sort of thing. And that what that looks like is putting the supports in place and showing that they support it. And I think that comes through loud and clear with the type of support to be flexible with the blending of roles, perhaps, or enabling, you know, staff if somebody wants to go out on a fishing trip or another outing, or again spend the extra time sitting in the neighborhood with residents and engaging in that way, that it's not frowned upon, that it's really supported, encouraged, and looked upon favorably as an important role, you know, for staff to engage in. So just to wrap up, one final quote that I think speaks to this, the importance of visionary leadership, is this. It's that I bought some touch plays. It's a big computer game. And now when staff are sitting and doing their paperwork, they will play the game with the residents, and they know that's okay. A manager is not going to pass and say, oh, you're just sitting down playing games, you know, and minimize that or dismiss that. We make sure we educate them and tell them it's okay. So again, I think that speaks loud and clear to permission, you know, not more than permission, probably support and encouragement for this to happen, and putting relational approaches to care, you know, front and center in all that they do. So when that happens in a home, it really filters down through all staff, family, and residents as well. So that's my talk. Probably time for questions. I don't know how. Oh, okay, yeah, a few minutes left. All right.
On prend les questions de la salle en premier, puis après ça, Sana pour le webinaire aussi.
Anybody has a question?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this topic. I'm thinking about the relational aspect of your studies. And when you talk about you went to different establishments with the ratio of residents between 60-something to 200 and something,
yeah,
convention. In terms of the staff and the cultural change to it, because it's a big thing. I agree with you.
Right.
Culture for me, for example, you know, I work in a long-term care facility, and it's a big cultural change too. Like you say, when the staff is interacting with the residents, they have to know their residents, because sometimes, for example, I would say residents from Holocaust survivors, for example, you have to choose their words correctly.
Right.
You know, so you wouldn't bring upon a memory that is very disruptive to this person, to the resident. So again, it's knowing your residents, knowing your clientele.
Yeah.
But I think like this morning we had an interdisciplinary team meeting, and one of the residents said, "Oh, I want my certain staff member. How come he's not here all the time?" You know,
okay.
So he formed a relationship with this person, but of course, you know, reality is that the staff member cannot be there 24 hours. But this resident has a close relationship with the staff member,
right?
And you know, that makes him feel better, you know, and it helps him through the day when the staff member is there.
Yeah,
so again, like you mentioned, relationship is a big aspect.
And having those consistent staff, you know,
exactly.
That's the staff who are closest to the resident, or how that happens, I suppose, is maintaining that consistent staff assignment on certain floors or units or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. So your question was around the challenge of that, or the size?
Well, there are lots of challenges.
There are. Yeah, sure. And it is. I mean, the one thing I think these examples that were shared with me are really, really powerful, and certainly inspired me in thinking that, okay, there's, you know, we're moving in the right direction, I think. But nobody ever made it sound like it didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. And as I said, I think that there's the importance to have buy-in. So the leadership aspect is key, but everyone, you know, needs to buy in, and that doesn't always happen overnight either. There's, you know, people that maybe work, and I'm not saying that people who've worked somewhere a long time are necessarily disgruntled or anything, but maybe sometimes people can be set in their ways and a little resistant to change, perhaps, and And so I think, yeah, it requires working constantly on that particular challenge. But coming up when everybody, works together on this, there are some compromises for sure, but there's a lot of ideas. It's not just that, oh, if I'm the manager or the administrator of the home, I need to solve all these issues and, try to make everybody happy. I'm getting feedback from residents constantly and from family members constantly and staff constantly, and trying to, everybody's working to overcome the challenges together, which I think makes a big difference. Yeah.
I think you were right about the CEO just tell me what to do. I think a lot of them are up there and they don't know how to do it. They do the best they can, and sometimes it's never the right way, and
yeah.
They need people. It's like, I guess ourselves, we need to know our residents before we plan for them. They need to know they're the people in their institution, and they don't
Absolutely.
really know how to do that or what. So
yeah, particularly in the larger homes, like where if they're
staff. Or
yeah,
more,
exactly.
How do you
you're never going to know.
All different shifts, so nobody's left out. And,
yeah.
But your thing on that, I was puzzled about I guess once in a while doing it, but I have always talked to my residents, and they're like, I work on a higher functioning floor.
Okay.
So we're talking probably on the full steam 21 to 30. And I find that they don't like when you change the schedule, because for them, that gives them power. That they don't even have to look at
routine and consistency.
Oh, it's music today, it's Monday, it becomes routine, but they don't need a schedule, so it's empowering.
Yeah.
So I'm really trying to know how to. We do that once in a while, a few little special events here and there, and they're like that stuff. But they're not interested in reading.
Okay.
What's going on? Like they say, what's the movie tonight? I said, well, it's on the poster. They don't. But that's good, because that's their way of doing it, is by mouth.
Right. Yeah.
But I would.
That's it. That's interesting. And so I'm going to say a couple of different things to that. First, coming back to my own experience, where it was almost the opposite when I worked in long-term. Not opposite all the time. Certainly the calendar, people wanted that, much like you're talking about. But I remember another thing I did. So I had recreation staff on each of the floors that were responsible for their own programming and calendars, and they would just submit those to me. But my role above that was kind of the special events for every month.
Okay.
And so I would just put those out at the beginning of the month, usually, circulate them on the floors and that kind of thing. And I still remember, how exciting that day was. It created this buzz all through the home, because they had no idea, what was going to come out. Right? It's always a special event. It was not the regular programming, and it was a surprise. It was I remember it was like, if I didn't get that, I don't know what's going on. I'm like, so a bit of surprise. So a bit of surprise, excitement into the home for sure. But I think both are at play for sure. Consistency is comforting, and I think maybe to answer your question more directly in terms of this kind of study, it speaks to their involvement in every step. So I think if you just completely changed everything and thought that maybe you were following the culture change principles that I talked about earlier in the presentation, say, I'm going to follow these and change my programming up to align with them more without resident input and involvement on every step, that would probably backfire and not have the end result that you're hoping for. But if you invited them to look at the calendar together and say, what about these programs do you like? What do you want to keep? What do you want to change? You might, be surprised, much like the staff who shared that. So her staff were actually in shock. They were just so surprised that the residents wanted to change that many things about a calendar that had been successful, by their lives, in terms of residents willingly going to the programming and actually, so they thought enjoying the programming, but so sure, it was fine, but if we had the choice, we would do something else, So I think that's the big key is really keeping them, in part of the process, a real big part of the process. Yeah. That's
Any other question or comment before we move on?
I meant to ask this earlier of the group, but how many people in the room actually work in recreation and leisure in some way? Oh, most of you. Okay. All right. I guess that doesn't surprise me a lot, but yeah, I was sure. And then who else is in the room? Other staff, like nursing staff or researcher? Okay. Resident? Oh, thank you for coming. And family or?
Rehab.
Oh, okay, awesome. Yeah, I don't know. So I'm curious. You know, I've given this. This is the first time I've given this talk to practitioners. I've only done it at a research conference before, so a room full of researchers who think it's great, but they're not the ones living it on, you know, on a daily basis. But I often wonder about the challenges. Like, are there things that, you know, because as I said, I realize that it sounds pretty idealistic sometimes. Some of the examples shared are like, that'd be great. Yeah, who wouldn't want to live in a home that has a wine club every month? And, you know, again, I'm not stuck on one in particular, but, you know, or some really positive changes. But I don't know, when you think about it.
I was impressed by the fact that the resident could go and help with the groceries, grocery shopping.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm thinking about our facility, and it's like
Changes that have happened.
yeah.
Well, yeah,
That's a challenge.
for sure. But in that one, and one thing I didn't say when I shared that particular example or that quote was, I still remember having a conversation with that participant who said that they, again, were all quite surprised. They would never, it was something new. They were trying to incorporate more choice and, you know, into residents' daily lives, and they weren't really sure that residents had the capabilities to go to the grocery store, you know, physically, you know, cognitively, to do those sorts of things, but they could, you know, and more often than not, and with some support obviously in place, but that residents really relish that opportunity to go, like, I haven't shopped for groceries in 5 years or whatever since I've moved in to long-term care, and something that I think most of us take for granted. Some of us, like me, hate grocery shopping, but you know, yeah, but probably it was denied for me, or if I didn't have the opportunity, I'd miss it, I bet. So I think in some cases perhaps there could be a tendency to underestimate what our residents can do, and when we don't try, you know, I think. Not always, but certainly sometimes.
So are you saying that it's really more our role as recreation staff to nurture that, to start nurturing it from that level and hoping that it plants a seed for management to open up their eyes to?
Well, not completely. Like, I don't want to suggest that all of the responsibility is on you, you know, as a recreation staff member. I think this data suggests that recreation staff have an important role to play, for sure. But again, I think a culture change initiative needs to start, like, it could be something that you bring forth to management within your home and say, you know, we're reading about culture change, what do you think? But it can't just be only recreation staff being the sole drivers of a movement like that. It's a movement that needs complete, you know, buy-in and support. Yeah, yeah. And buy-in's not, as I said, that doesn't happen overnight. Even if it's the administrator of the home coming and saying, like, hey, you know, we can make some positive changes within the home. Why don't we engage in the culture change process? I think there'll be a lot of bumps in the first place, but if part of that is, I mean, I hope some of these examples are useful in the sense that it could be, and if I also just say, so leisure itself, not necessarily only the responsibility of people who are tasked with providing leisure, you know, like, there's no reason why other staff members within a home could not use leisure itself as a broader way of, you know, making life more enjoyable and their jobs more enjoyable and getting to know residents, you know. I think about examples when I worked in long-term care, where there were a couple of housekeeping staff who were amazing at that, and they would, you know, bring in certain games or activities or sit and tell jokes and, you know, incorporate that into their workday as much as possible, like aspects of leisure where they got to know the residents a lot better. They were happier because of it. The residents were happier because of it. It was a win-win, you know. But it does take having a supervisor in that sense to say, okay, well, maybe you didn't get things cleaned as diligently as you could have, but you built these connections, and that's more important, you know. So it's kind of trading in the efficiency for relationships, you know, for value in that. So, yeah. Hi.
I'm trying to formulate my question as I speak. I think Quebec is rather unique in terms of politics, and I'm wondering if your research project would ever tackle how do you deal with the government when the government budgeting affects the way the homes are run. I mean, this is a much larger question.
Yeah.
Aside from that, I'm wondering if you ran into differences in the program in different provinces depending on the philosophy of the people at the top.
A bit, yeah, and certainly different participants in the study spoke about different financial barriers that looked, and there was quite a broad spectrum of that. You know, some homes seemed like they were rolling in the money, you know, and I was like, but you're able to do all that? Like, you know, pretty jealous when I was listening to the you know, what they were telling me, and other homes were struggling a bit more so. In some of the more positive examples, this is less so about government and more the financial resources, but trying to come up with, you know, creative ways of getting around budget restrictions, you know, whether, and again, that does speak to heavy involvement, I think, you know, when you have a very active, I worked at a home that had an active, we had a ladies auxiliary at the time. I don't know if that exists as or I don't even know if it's as common anymore. I don't think it exists at that home anymore, but they were really, really active in doing special events and sales constantly to supplement at least our budget in the recreation department and to make things happen. I mean, they ended up raising so much money at one point in time that we were able to, you know, buy a bus that we never had the budget for, and those sorts of things. So pretty active, you know, auxiliary in that sense, but could be family members and residents were involved too. I remember baking, them doing some baking and selling it for, you know, raise money because they wanted a bigger TV or something in the, you know, for movie night or something along those lines. So I think there are potential ways to get around some of that. You know, I'm less able to speak to the government. I mean, there's other government restrictions, I think, of over and above financial restrictions that can maybe impede things. Like, I'm thinking about policies and stuff that, you know, mandate certain things happen and that might stand in the way of culture change, you know. Certainly, yeah, I mean, and I don't know, I wish I knew, and I wish I had participants at the time from Quebec to understand if, you know, if there were any particular differences. I'm sure there are some in Quebec, but just to give an example of that, I went to a play just yesterday, actually, on, it was called Cracked, A New Light on Dementia, and, you know, it was the focus of the play. It was a research-based performance that spoke about different ways of viewing, you know, people living with dementia and how to support them in living well, and, you know, taking the focus off, you know, that they're always necessarily suffering and those sorts of things. And they really highlighted some challenging practices in terms of policy in the play, where, you know, in long-term care, there was a staff member that came to the administrator and said, you know, I need to see the policy on birthdays because somebody's having a birthday and I don't know what to do, you know. And as ridiculous as that sounds, there are probably policies on that, because, and I think, and the funny thing about that, I mean, it's funny, it's absurd at the same time, but it probably started, it was probably a well-intentioned policy so that nobody got forgotten, you know. So, oh, how can we ensure that we do something special for every resident when it's their birthday? And then it becomes this standardized practice where you don't appreciate the uniqueness of residents. So then later in this performance, that same staff went back to the administrator and said, you know what, someone just turned 90 last week. And in speaking with her about, you know, what it is that she wanted for her 90th birthday, she wanted red balloons, but that's not in our policy, you know, to make, like, so I couldn't do it, kind of thing. He said, maybe we could revisit this policy and see if we can change that up. And so sometimes it's real simple stuff, like it's, you know, but policies can be limiting, perhaps, and I think on, at least at the home level, it's looking at their own policies that they have in place with a new eye, like even the well-intentioned ones, to think, is this standing in the way of relational care? Is it standing in the way of us treating residents as unique people and not just treating them all the same, you know, that sort of thing? But also maybe being an advocate for change in policy at the government level, like if things are standing in the way of making changes within each individual home, then a number of homes in the province should perhaps band together a little bit and speak loudly, you know, to make change. So I think that could happen.
I think also here in the Centre West that a couple of institutions that have been recognized by Plain Tree, which is a organization in the States, have embraced it. Dr. Rosenberg has embraced it, so this is something that we'll start to feel in other facilities.
Yeah, and that's actually a culture change model. Yeah. Plain Tree model is one model of many. You know, there's Eden Alternative and others that over the years have you know.
So that's something we're all going to be working towards.
Yeah.
At least it's starting from above, but they don't know what to do, so we need to help them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it does sometimes have to start small, you know, 1 or 2 homes making a difference, and then maybe, you know, bringing researchers on board perhaps to you know, put some documentation to that. Like to say, hey, this is the difference it's made in our home. You know, then you have research, then you have evidence-based practice, and then that helps change the minds of people in power. And again, it doesn't happen overnight, but it needs to start somewhere. So that's a great example. Yeah.
Congratulations for your research.
Thanks.
I'm Father Gregory. I'm a Catholic chaplain here at St. Margaret's. I only work here for 3 hours a week.
Oh, okay.
At Father Dowd, I was given a time to work for 15 hours for the whole week.
Oh, okay.
So there's one thing that I discovered. For extroverted people, residents, it's so easy for them to relate with other residents.
Mm-hmm.
But introverted people, I think these are the people that we really need to work hard, because the mentality is, a number of them, when I started working here about 2009 down, introverted people would rather invest more a good relationship with the staff, with the recreation, than with co-residents.
That's
The
true.
underlying mentality is they're afraid to invest a relationship with their co-residents because I don't know what will happen to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I would rather give more time and invest a good relationship with residents. And that's why whenever I see our recreation staff here, you can see that how our residents are really happy seeing them, and how there's really a connection with the residents and our recreation staff. And I think this is one of the things that at least people who are working in research and in recreation and stuff, that they need to be aware that there's a culture, there's a mentality around them. I would rather entrust my life. Anything that I want to share with the staff than with my co-residents.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
I think your program, to know the residents, to have a good relationship, would actually create a big impact to the residents. So
absolutely, and that's all staff, I think. I mean, certainly, you know, recreation and leisure staff are in a unique position. I think a very lucky one, I might say, to really get to know residents in it easier, because you know, you see residents at their best and engaged in activities they enjoy and things like that. But that's not to say that those relationships can't happen with other staff too, if the time and effort is put into enabling that. And I know there are a lot of professions that you know, sort of maybe don't want that to happen. Like, you know, this idea of professional boundaries, and I'm the worker, you're the resident. And I think one thing that culture change is hopefully maybe turning that idea on its head a little bit, or questioning it as to why do we need necessarily such rigid boundaries all the time? I mean, these relationships are a pretty natural thing, and when you spend that much time, you know, our work life and, you know, working in long-term care, we're here 8 hours a day with the residents that we're working with, of course relationships are going to develop, right, if we allow for it to happen. But so to be more encouraging of that happening and supporting that to happen, I think is really important for both. You know, it's rewarding for everybody then, right? I mean, I certainly want to come to work more, and I would value my job a lot more if I come to work and I spend time with people I love, you know, and want to see every day, than people are, I go in, you know, and see people, you know, that don't mean as much to me, I suppose, and then it just becomes a job, right? So yeah, I think that's a really important point about that.
I'm afraid I'll have to.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody.
If you have other questions, or if you want to, you know, contact us, we can maybe see if.
Oh yeah, I can share my email and stuff if anybody.
Come back in a year and then talk some more. Thank you so much, and hopefully everybody has signed the list, so they can keep in touch with us at CREGÉS, and we'll share with the other researchers.
The PowerPoint will be online, and the recording of the conference. And also, you will receive a survey key to evaluate the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again. The recording went.